On March 17, 1945, in the quiet farmlands of Rockford, Illinois, a convoy of military trucks rolled quietly past frostbitten barns and half-melted snowbanks, carrying inside them what no local had expected to see so close to home: German women, prisoners of war. The townspeople watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. These were not the hardened soldiers from commercials or propaganda reels. No, these were factory workers, medics, clerks, women still in steel-grey uniforms, eyes wary, expressions hollow. The air was raw and cold, the sun weak against the grey sky, and every engine rumble seemed to echo the silent question hanging over the road: why bring the enemy here? Inside one of the trucks, 22-year-old Anna Vogel clutched her bag, knuckles white. She had prepared for hostility, for spitting crowds or barbed insults, but what she would find instead, just hours later, challenged everything the Reich had ever allowed her to believe. The trucks pulled into a makeshift camp on the edge of town, a former civilian conservation corps site, hastily repurposed with barbed wire fencing and new signs reading POW, authorized personnel only. Guards in olive uniforms stepped forward, not with rifles raised, but with cautious, almost embarrassed cordiality. "Line up, please," one called, his voice more Midwestern hospitality than military bark. Anna stepped down from the truck, boots crunching on gravel, her eyes scanning for snarls, for threats, for everything she'd been taught about Americans. Instead, she found strange contradictions. A young soldier held the gate open, avoiding her gaze but offering a quiet, "Ma'am." Nearby, tables stood with hot coffee and sandwiches, a simple American lunch steaming in tin cups. The smell was staggering. Real bread, not sawdust-dense rations. Anna stared. Was it a trick? Her stomach clenched. Back in Dresden, her mother once whispered, "If they ever take you, do not expect mercy." And yet, here this was not war. This was something else. A different kind of silence began to settle over her. That night, inside the barracks lined with folding cots and wool blankets, Anna lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams warped from years of cold. The women murmured softly around her in thick Saxon and Berlin dialects, their voices uncertain, laden with disbelief. No interrogations, no screamed orders, just paperwork, a bed, and dinner, real potatoes, cooked cabbage, apple sauce that tasted like a memory of something before the war. Anna kept waiting for the mask to drop, for the cold machinery of vengeance to begin. Those around her had thought the same. Irma Becker, older and sharp-tongued, whispered that the coffee must be drugged. Lena, barely 18 from Stuttgart, cried over the soap she was given. "It smells like flowers," she murmured, clutching it as if it might vanish. Even the guards seemed out of place. One had stumbled through a Guten Abend, too polite to be mocking. Outside, the American flag shifted lazily in the wind, indifferent. What was this place? A prison with kindness, a cage, yet full of warmth. Inside Anna's chest, discomfort stirred not from fear, but from the slow erosion of certainty. What if the world she had pledged herself to had been lying all along? Morning came cloaked in a gentle fog. Cornfields stirred in the breeze beyond the wire fence, their yellowing stalks a last breath before harvest. The women stood in uneven lines for roll call, coats draped over thin shoulders, their eyes squinting into the strange light. Anna noticed the details now, the guard's nervous smile, the way he shifted from foot to foot, the sweat on his brow even in the chill. They didn't look victorious. They looked uncomfortable. As if imprisoned by compassion they didn't know how to wield. After roll call, the women were taken in small groups to a red brick building labeled Administration. Anna was handed forms and a number. She paused when she understood the question being asked. "Are you treated well here?" It was translated into her language, carefully. A pencil was offered politely. The question was like a jolt of static. Treated well? She thought of the bread, the cot, the soap. Yes, but wasn't that the wrong answer? Or had the Reich been wrong from the start? The following days passed in a rhythm that felt eerily humane. There were duties to perform kitchen work, laundry, helping locals gather fallen branches after a recent storm, always under supervision, but never abuse. American townspeople drove past in pickup trucks, slowing to gawk but rarely shouting. Some waved, awkwardly, as if unsure whether kindness was allowed. One Tuesday, a woman from town arrived with a crate of books, German classics among them, Goethe, Mann, even a dog-eared volume of Grimm's Tales. She smiled hesitantly, then left without a word. Anna watched her go, fingers pressed to the worn cover of Wilhelm Tell. Inside the pages, a memory, her father's voice reading aloud by candlelight, long before conscription stole everything. That night, the women sat in a circle, reading aloud, laughter hesitating past their lips like songbirds uncertain of spring. Suspicion hadn't vanished, but it had softened, and where belief once stood like a wall, now stood a question. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps the lie had lived inside them all along. Then came the Sunday afternoon that would become a turning point. A visit, unexpected and brief, from an American officer fluent in German. His name was Captain Ellis, and he entered the barracks carrying a phonograph. No one spoke as he set it down on a wooden stool, opened a leather case, and produced a vinyl record, scuffed but intact. He explained in near-perfect Berlin accent that donations had come from local families. They thought the women might need comfort. Without waiting for permission, he placed the needle down. Soft static cracked, followed by music Schubert's Ave Maria. The room fell still. Even Irma Becker, who rarely showed emotion, turned her face toward the sound and blinked rapidly. For the first time, the walls did not feel like barriers. They reverberated with something old, something human. In that moment, tears came not from fear nor grief, but from memory, ripped untethered by kindness. A melody forbidden now became a truth they could not deny. After the music faded, the silence that followed was more sacred than sorrowful. No one moved. The phonograph clicked, then whirred into stillness, its task completed. Captain Ellis nodded once and left without ceremony, leaving behind something heavier than records. That night, Anna couldn't sleep, not from discomfort, but from the rush of thoughts that refused to quiet. She remembered a day in Leipzig, 5 years ago, when the radio in her schoolroom was smashed because it picked up a foreign broadcast. She had cheered, she had believed, they all had. But here, now, across an ocean and inside a compound meant for punishment, she was hearing the same notes that had been silenced by fire and fear. What had they been fighting against, if not this frail, persistent humanity? Outside her window, the American night stretched wide and peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played, faint and full of ache, and Anna felt something terrible. She missed home, but she did not want to go back. The days grew colder, yet the women's rituals grew warmer. They swept floors with diligence, not out of fear but necessity, and tended to garden beds that had thawed with the first hints of October Sunday. The guards began calling them by their first names. Once, during laundry duty, Anna and Lena were given an apple pie by the cook still warm, its flaky crust browned in a way Anna had only seen in magazine cuttings. She held the slice too long before eating it, overwhelmed by the smell alone. It made her think of her grandmother's kitchen, of tin plates and warm milk, before Luftschutz and shortages. On some unspoken level, the American camp had become more than a place of confinement. It had become a mirror showing each woman not who she was taught to be, but who she had once been. And with each warm gesture, it was as if a ghost was being exorcised from their chests, one breath at a time. One evening, just after supper, a peculiar request arrived. The camp commander, a weathered man named Colonel Matthews, asked for volunteers to assist at a nearby Red Cross depot. The request puzzled many. It wasn't a task forced upon them, but offered. Anna felt her hand lift almost without her consent. The next day, she was driven with 3 others to a nondescript building outside town. Inside, rows of boxes labeled "Relief for Europe" covered the floor. Clothing, canned goods, toys, all destined for war-torn regions, perhaps even for Germans still in rubble-swept cities like Dresden and Berlin. As Anna sorted scarves and gloves, her fingers paused over a note tucked into a parcel. "To whomever finds this, you are not forgotten." The handwriting was careful, in English, with a child's shaky drawing of a dove. Something cracked inside her then. They were the enemy, yet here they were holding compassion in their hands, addressed from strangers they had once been told to fear. irony cut deeper than any cruelty could. In the weeks that followed, the lines between captor and captive wore thinner than the wire fence that encircled the camp. A local church choir was permitted to perform one afternoon, their hymns filling the air like sunlight spilled through stained glass. Some women stood at the edge of the gathering, hands clenched, faces unreadable. Others listened with their eyes closed, swaying slightly, the music touching places war had buried. Anna found herself humming along, unfamiliar with the lyrics but moved by the gentle harmony. One morning she returned from peeling potatoes to discover that her name had been stitched onto a small towel. Someone in the laundry had done it, a simple embroidered AV in blue thread. No announcement, no explanation, just a human detail that shattered the script of enemies. That night, she wrote her first letter home, unsure it would ever arrive. She started it slowly. I am safe. But more than that, I am confused. They told us one story, and here another is unfolding, one I never knew I needed to hear. Then came October 28th, a day that should have passed without note, but instead ruptured the quiet recalibration of belief. A telegram arrived at the camp news from Europe. Dresden in ruins, Berlin suffocating in siege, the Reich collapsing faster than any had dared predict. The war was slipping away from German hands, not with dignity but devastation. That evening, the radio in the mess hall was turned low for translation. President Truman spoke about rebuilding, about justice, about peace. Anna sat motionless, spoon idle in her hand. Around her, murmurs rippled. For months, they had lived in a strange suspension, but now the anchor was gone. The story they had carried inside them of German strength, of righteous purpose, it dissolved like sugar in the coffee they now drank without fear. That night, Irma wept not for the homeland, but for her son raised on promises and drowned in rubble. Outside, the American flag still fluttered, silent and constant, indifferent to the stories collapsing within the minds of its prisoners. And Anna, staring into the dark beyond the barracks window, understood the bitter truth. Captivity had freed her. November arrived with winds sharp enough to steal breath, and the last of the camp's garden beds withered under frost. But something deeper had already frostbitten the hearts of the POWs, the knowledge that their homes might no longer exist, that their beliefs had fractured beyond repair. Letters, delayed and censored, began to arrive in hues of despair. One by one, women learned of lost fathers, mothers vanished amid firebombings, whole streets erased. Yet amid that private devastation, the camp routine held steady warm porridge, bare chapel services, occasional laughter by the laundry lines. On the outside, it would appear merciful. On the inside, it was survival built on contradiction. Anna moved slower now, as if every motion threatened to disturb something fragile inside her chest. She no longer feared Americans, she feared returning to a Germany that might not recognize her, or worse, one she could no longer recognize herself. In freedom, she had been lied to. In captivity, she had been awakened. And that irony, quiet and cruel, would be the heaviest luggage she carried home. The day of departure came not with the marching orders of a military command, but with a courier's knock and a clipboard of names. The women were told they would be transferred, some perhaps repatriated, others rerouted to different camps before the war's end. No one cheered. They packed in silence, folding wool blankets with the care given to relics. Anna tied her hair back, then paused at the edge of her cot, fingers hovering over the embroidered towel. She slipped it into her satchel without a word. As the trucks rumbled to life, the guards did not salute. One young sentry simply nodded at her, eyes wet, then turned away quickly. As she climbed aboard, Lena gripped Anna's sleeve. "Will they understand us back home?" she asked. Anna didn't reply. She didn't know the answer. The scenery rolled by in somber hues, cornfields thinned to husks under a grim October sky. And as the gate behind them creaked shut, Anna looked back, not to prison walls, but to a place where fiction had been unmade. What had begun in chains had ended in contradiction. Prisoner, enemy, woman, free in ways no flag could define. Years later, long after the war had ended and borders had redrawn themselves across a bleeding Europe, Anna Vogel would sit alone in a quiet Berlin apartment, lined with books instead of banners. The world had rebuilt, but the cracks remained, visible only to those who had stretched their identities across enemy lines and survived. On her mantel sat a photograph of Rockford's camp, not the fences or the watchtowers, but of the garden that bloomed one fall, stubborn and small, behind the mess hall. Next to it, folded carefully in a wooden box, lay the towel marked AV in blue thread. She had kept it through years of discomfort and silence, a token of a truth too complicated for parades or history books. In a world hungry for heroes and villains, Anna had learned that some stories resist clean endings, and as the wind brushed the window like a finger on glass, she would sometimes wonder if kindness could undo what war had built. What else had they been wrong about? That question, silent and persistent, was the sentence the war had left her to carry forever. Once, in the early spring of 1952, Anna returned to America not as a prisoner, but as a guest of a cultural exchange program designed to heal old wounds. She stood again on Illinois soil, older now, her hair streaked with gray, language softer on her tongue. The streets of Rockford were wider, the camp long dismantled, but some things remained, the red brick administration building now a public library. The trees she'd once seen bare now standing full and green. In the library's archives, she found a photograph dated 1945. A row of women behind barbed wire, faces unreadable. Her own eyes stared back, young and closed to what they would soon learn. She carried the photo out into the afternoon light, sat on a bench where lilacs bloomed, and pressed it beside the towel still folded in her purse. Wars had ends, but memory did not. It clung, quietly, like scent clings to old cloth, invisible, inescapable, and for those who lived both sides of a lie, it never entirely faded. And yet, despite it all, the story of Anna Vogel and the women of Rockford remained largely untold, buried beneath louder tales of victory and vengeance, absent from textbooks that preferred clarity over complexity. But memory has a habit of lingering where it's least expected, in the soft creases of a towel, in the fading ink of a child's drawing, in the quiet decency of a soldier who held open a gate instead of raising a gun. These fragments, scattered and small, whispered something powerful across the ruins of ideology, that even in a world aflame with certainty, the most dangerous weapon was grace. Anna never became a symbol. She didn't want to be. She simply lived her life one stitched together with questions, with contradictions, with the indelible proof that sometimes humanity blooms not in the absence of war, but in its unlikeliest prisons. And when the world tried to move on, Anna remembered and refused to forget. Today, few remember the convoy that rolled through Rockford in the dying days of a brutal war, or the women inside it, whose stories unraveled not with terror, but with tenderness. Yet their footsteps still echo through the quiet corridors of history, deliberately hushed by the volumes that came after. What happened there will never fill museum wings or monument plaques. It was too small, too nuanced, too human. But maybe that's where truth most often resides, not in the roar of battle or the declarations of leaders, but in a slice of pie shared across enemy lines, in letters never sent, in soap that smelled like flowers. Anna Vogel lived a long life after Rockford, but she never debated the politics that had shaped her youth, nor the righteousness of one side over another. Instead, whenever someone spoke in absolutes about who is good and who is evil, she would simply close her eyes, touch the towel hidden in the drawer beside her bed, and remember what she knew to be true, that when the world demanded allegiance, the quiet ones who chose compassion instead were the bravest of all. So the story ends not with victory nor with vengeance, but with a girl named Anna, who stepped from her nation's myths into the difficult clarity of truth. Rockford never built a monument to what happened there, but its silence is a monument in itself, one made of lives quietly reassembled, of beliefs dismantled, of identity reforged beneath unfamiliar skies. What the Reich feared most wasn't American bombs or tanks. It was this, that a mind freed by kindness might never again submit to blind obedience. And that, in the end, was what the camp in Illinois had offered, not punishment, but perilous enlightenment. For Anna and women like her, captivity did not steal dignity. It restored it. And when the years took everything else, memory remained heavy, silent, and sharp as a needle, still stitching new questions into the fabric of history, still reminding us that the strange courage to listen, to doubt, to offer mercy, is the only kind that endures. And perhaps that is why the story of those women, Anna, Irma, Lena, and so many others, should not be forgotten, even if it's never taught, because it calls not for celebration, but for contemplation. It challenges the seductive simplicity of flags and borders, of labels that turn humans into enemies with a stroke of ink. In that quiet corner of Illinois, far from the front lines and the fanfare, something subversive had taken root. The realization that no ideology, no matter how meticulously constructed, can erase the need for dignity. Anna's memory, stitched into a towel and a life spent questioning, now belongs not just to her, but to all who have the courage to believe in grace where none is owed. The gate at Rockford may have closed, the buildings may be gone, but the lesson endures not in textbooks, not in monuments, but in the quiet courage it takes to unlearn hate. That is where the war truly ended, and for some, where life truly began. Long after twilight settled over her life, Anna Vogel would sometimes awaken from dreams drenched in sound, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots, the crackle of Schubert from a phonograph, the weary murmur of names called at roll. The war had ended, yes, but Anna carried it like breath, invisible yet constant. In old age, her hands trembled, but her memory remained crisp, like frost under moonlight. She kept no medals, no flags, no photos on her walls, only the towel, stitched with AV, and a small notebook with a single entry dated decades past. Mercy is not surrender, it is survival. When she died, there was no ceremony, only her quiet ashes carried back to Illinois by a niece who had never met her but had read her words. They buried her near a field where corn once swayed beside wire fences, and where once just briefly the impossible had bloomed, in silence, as it always had. There are histories engraved in stone, and there are those held in breath passed not by force, but by memory's quiet insistence. The story of the German women POWs in Rockford never demanded to be told. It lingered in the spaces between headlines, beneath the weight of louder victories, waiting for ears brave enough to listen without judgment. In classrooms and airports and whispering forests, the echo of women like Anna still stirs, not as martyrs, not as monsters, but as mirrors. What happened in that Midwestern camp was not an epic, it was not convenient, it was simply true. And in a world that still insists on absolutes, whispers like hers matter more than ever. Because when we forget that change begins with a gesture, a loaf of bread, a thread of kindness across razor wire, we make war inevitable again. In Anna's silence we find our warning that peace, the most impossible thing of all, still depends on the smallest choices we dare to make. And so, long after headlines faded and graves were weathered by time, the true legacy of Rockford lived in the intangible, in lullabies sung without bitterness, in names whispered with reverence, in the careful choice to look deeper than one's indoctrination. The war had left them, the women, the guards, the townsfolk not unchanged, but unshackled in strange, quiet ways. Anna's story was never meant to shine. It was meant to haunt, to humble, to hold a mirror to the face of every certainty. Some histories shout to be heard, hers whispered, and in that whisper was a power far greater than victory, understanding, the kind that could only blossom amid ash, behind barbed wire, carried forward gently in the hands of those who refuse to forget that, even in war, there are moments when humanity dares to bloom, and when it does impossibly, briefly it cannot be unseen, nor should it be. And perhaps in the end, that is all history can offer us, not resolution, but reckoning. The tale of Anna Vogel is not a lesson in patriotism or betrayal, not a parable to condemn or absolve. It is a record of what happens when a lie crumbles in the face of unexpected mercy. It asks us to consider how belief is born, how cruelty is justified, and how even the truest conviction can falter in the presence of a gentle voice or a warm slice of bread. In remembering her, and the nameless women who walked beside her through frost, doubt, and awakening, we remember that truth is not found in speeches or banners, but in the moments when human beings choose to see each other, not as symbols, but as souls. And when someone, long from now, asks what happened in Rockford in those final months of war, the answer will not be shouted, it will be whispered gently, something impossible and unforgettable. Far beyond the borders of nations and the fading allegiance of wartime flags, the story of Rockford endures because it refuses to die cleanly. It drifts instead in memory's quieter chambers, in the scent of apple pie, in the embroidered edge of a towel, in the aching silence between two former enemies who once shared a winter's kindness. Anna's journey was never about betrayal, nor about redemption. It was about the moment when certainty fractured and something gentler took root in its place. The war asked for destruction. Rockford answered with decency. In a century sculpted by conflict, it is these minutes, soft, trembling, uncelebrated, that mark the deepest victories. For Anna and those like her, what happened wasn't just survival, it was revelation. And in the end, perhaps that is all that remains. The fragile hope that when history turns cruel, someone, somewhere, will offer warmth, even if it's just in a wool blanket, a word mispronounced but meant kindly, or bread shared across a line drawn in war. In a world so easily swayed by division, the story of Anna Vogel reminds us that the smallest gestures can dismantle even the most rigid constructions of hatred. No grand battle marked her transformation. No headlines declared her awakening. It emerged in silence through open gates, folded towels, quiet songs. And while the world may not remember her name, it is shaped by the quiet revolution she lived. For every uniform pressed by ideology, there lives a heartbeat capable of breaking rank. And somewhere, beyond record books and fallen empires, Anna and the women of Rockford still walk not as conquered or conquerors, but as the evidence that kindness needs no permission to be powerful, that in the icy reaches of a war's last chapter, something unthinkable once occurred. They arrived expecting punishment. They left with their humanity returned. And though the war ended in ash and surrender, in that quiet camp, something far more enduring had begun. So let it be remembered, not in stone or spectacle, but in shared breath, that once, near the end of the world's bloodiest war, the impossible happened in a quiet town in Illinois. Not an uprising, not a surrender, but a transformation born not of politics, but of unexpected grace. Anna Vogel and the women who arrived in shackles discovered something neither they nor their captors had fully anticipated: the disarming power of empathy. Years will pass. Names will fade. But somewhere, in the stillness of forgotten places and the echo of unrecorded kindnesses, that truth waits. It does not roar. It does not plead. It lingers like the smell of warm bread in winter air, like the thread of blue stitched with care in a name once feared. History may look away, but memory does not. And in the quiet rebellion of compassion, the war found its truest, most human end. Let the record remain incomplete, then not for lack of answers, but because the truth is too wide for any single ending. The women of Rockford, their foreign accents softened by time, did not live lives marked by triumphs, but by quiet reckonings that never stopped unfolding. In old age, some never spoke of the camp again. Others, like Anna Vogel, told only fragments, letting silence fill in the spaces too sacred or too sorrowful to name. Yet everywhere they went, they carried that impossible season not as trauma, but as testimony, that even in war, even surrounded by the ruins of what they'd believed, they had touched something rare. Not mercy demanded, not kindness granted with strings attached, but a moment of recognition, human to human. It was enough to change them forever. And if that moment, fleeting and uncelebrated, taught us anything, it is this: that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with the refusal to hate. So perhaps this story was never meant to be concluded, but merely carried in quiet remembrance, in the softened eyes of those who survived, and in the gentle bend of history where certainties once stood straight. What happened in Rockford resists summary because it was not a lesson, but a living question, one that still moves quietly among us, asking whether we are brave enough to see the enemy without armor, to offer bread instead of suspicion, to choose recognition over reduction. Anna Vogel's journey is not a monument carved in marble, but a thread passed hand to hand, fraying, fragile, and achingly real. And in that thread lies the dangerous, delicate truth that peace is never won in conference halls or treaties, but in the smallest, most unrecorded kindnesses. The impossible did not arrive with banners. It arrived quietly, as grace so often does, and in doing so, undid centuries of cruelty with nothing more than a moment of human decency. So Anna's story, and those of the women beside her, becomes not an epilogue but a soft inheritance passed not to nations or governments, but to us. Whoever we are, wherever we stand, we hold the quiet power to unmake the machinery of hate simply by refusing to turn away. There is no closure to this tale, no final lesson etched in marble or folded into textbooks. Only the hope that we will listen when histories like this whisper across time, that we will remember the towel, the phonograph, the sandwiches on tin trays, not as curiosities, but as proof that in humanity's darkest hour, someone chose light. If there is meaning to war, it lives not in the victor's boasts, but in moments where nobody won, only recognized each other. Anna Vogel did not defeat an army, but she faced a deeper truth, survived it, and now, through memory, hands it to us. Gently, bravely, as a question waiting to be answered. Perhaps then this is all history owes us, not the clarity we crave, but the courage to lean into complication. For Anna Vogel and the women who once stood beneath a foreign flag behind familiar wire, their legacy was never about endings. It was about the quiet beginnings seeded not in treaties or declarations, but in soap that smelled like flowers, in the gentleness of a borrowed language, in the recognition of fear mirrored in another's eyes. These fragments, easy to overlook, shimmer with the weight of something rare, the possibility that even in the mouth of war, we might choose to be kinder than the world expects. That, in the face of hatred dressed as certainty, grace can still stand its ground. Their story did not need to be loud to last, it needed only to be true, and in the hush that follows the telling, it remains a whisper through barbed memory, reminding us that the impossible is not what cannot be done, but what is rarely dared. And so, with the last threads of Anna Vogel's story woven into silence, we are left not with finality but with reckoning. The image of her young, then old, frightened, then fierce in quiet conviction, lingers not in textbooks or film reels, but in the gentle defiance of those who, against all they had been taught, chose to see the enemy as human. Rockford was not war's footnote, it was its contradiction, its hardest truth. It whispered that mercy is not the absence of justice, but the beginning of something stronger. And long after flags are folded and names forgotten, that truth waits in towel threads, in songs sung across language, in the raw and beautiful ache of awakening. The story has ended, but the question remains. When faced with certainty, will we choose understanding? When handed fear, will we extend grace? In the quiet moments, may we all remember, the impossible happened once, and could, again. And in that haunting echo of Rockford, as distant now as it was improbable then, we are reminded that the true measure of history lies not in the magnitude of its wars, but in the moments where something gentler, quieter, dared to endure. Anna Vogel's story began with barbed wire and lies, but it ended, or rather, continued as a slow, persistent hymn of recognition across divides. For in the smallest gestures, the ones no propaganda could predict or prevent, humanity declared itself indestructible. That camp, that towel, that breath between suspicion and compassion, they belong not to the past, but to the fragile hope of what we might still become. If we are wise, we will not seek honor in carved statutes, but in the courage to act kindly when cruelty feels easier. Let that be Rockford's legacy, not a tale of defeat or victory, but a testament that, sometimes, the softest choices are the strongest resistance of all. And so now, as the sun sets again over those empty Midwestern fields where wire once framed the world for women branded as enemies, we reflect on the questions they left behind, not just what was done to them, but what they discovered in spite of it. Anna Vogel's journey was a collision between doctrine and doubt, fear and humanity, silence and song. She and the others did not escape, war unchanged. They emerged carrying a different kind of scar, one forged not by violence, but by the quiet realization that kindness, when it appears uninvited, becomes the sharpest release. This story closes not with a flag, a gun, or a funeral, but with a whisper stitched into a towel, pressed into memory, and handed forward, not to glorify the past, but to warn the future. Never mistake cruelty for strength, nor mercy for weakness. For the impossible blooms not in grand gestures but in the smallest, most human acts of grace. And in that final echo, softer than anthem, truer than oath, the story of Anna Vogel is not buried, but breathed, not in headlines, but in hallways filled with quiet questions and old light. Her memory lives where empathy makes uneasy homes in the hearts of those once certain, once unbending. In classrooms flickering with curiosity, in strangers' silence before judgment, in hands that reach instead of recoil there, the impossible still flickers. Rockford may have vanished in brick and barbed wire, but its truth remains unshakable. That mercy, given without demand, reshapes more lives than any victory ever could. So we are left, not with a summary, but with a seed, daring us to plant kindness where hate has rooted, to listen before we speak, and to believe, even if only for a trembling moment, that when all feels lost, a simple act of grace can still turn enemies into mirrors. And that, perhaps, is where history truly begins. So let it end here, not with spectacle but with breath, the kind held when truth settles in deep. Rockford is quiet now, its fences long rusted away, its stories unraveled not by historians but by time, softly and without permission. But in a drawer somewhere the thread still glimmers, a towel marked AV, waits, weathered but unquestioned, holding in every stitch the memory of a winter where mercy spoke louder than orders. Anna Vogel's life did not change the war, but it told a quieter tale of hands not raised in violence but extended in compassion. And that tale, small though it was, still matters, because it tells us what flags forget, that redemption does not roar, it whispers, and that when we choose to listen, really listen, we may yet find between nations, between names, the place where the impossible not only happened, but waits to happen again. Somewhere quiet, somewhere kind, somewhere just brave enough. And so we close the chapter, not with certainty or applause, but with the fragile understanding that stories like Anna Vogel's do not simply end. They remain suspended in the moments that defied cruelty, in the faces of those who learn to see enemies as reflections, not threats. In the quiet, frost-bitten fields of Rockford, where the past once held its breath, something unmeasurable occurred, a defeat of hatred not by force, but by the slow, unyielding work of mercy. Let us not wrap her tale in conclusions, for it was never about answers. It was about the courage to feel when numbness was easier, to question when belief was demanded, and maybe, just maybe, that is the true legacy of a war so often remembered for its fire that, even among ashes, the impossible can still take root. It grows silent, stubborn, and unseen, until one day, someone notices and remembers. So leave it where it stands, without resolution, without heroism, only with the solemn breath of memory still unfolding. Anna Vogel does not ask us to pity her, nor to celebrate her resilience. She asks us to remember that when war stripped everyone bare, the only thing that endured was how one soul chose to treat another. In Rockford, they arrived as enemies, they departed as witnesses, and in every act of overlooked grace, in sandwiches, placed gently on tin, in borrowed books whispered across a language divide, in a towel stitched with trembling hope, they found an emancipation none of their commanding officers could understand. That is the heart of this story. Not the war that raged, but the gentleness that dared to bloom beneath it. The impossible did happen, and it happened not in battlefields, but in the quiet corners where fear met mercy and changed. Let the silence now carry what cannot be shouted. Let it remain fragile, human, and true.